At this point, I'd like to introduce our Dean, Keith Montgomery, who wasn't able to join us yesterday, but just has a few opening remarks. Keith.
Thank you. So a belated but heartfelt welcome to UWMC's Good Ideas program. Thank you for coming and welcome to campus. I wasn't here yesterday because I had some UWMC Foundation business off campus. And, the foundation for this campus does tremendous work. They disperse over $160,000 in scholarship funds to students who are entering or continuing or transferring, and that's absolutely vital for those students' financial well-being in the long run. Of course, if you come here first, you save a lot of money, really, in terms of long-term education, and you still get the same UW quality. UW system reports show that our students who transfer out, over 80% of them go on to graduate, and that's well above the UW system average. So we got quality and we got cost, we got value here at UWMC. So I'm always delighted to report that. I think the big news this week is the UW system is selecting a new president, and when I say system, I mean that's what we call the big system. UWMC is part of UW colleges, and UW colleges is in there with all the baccalaureate and doctoral institutions as part of the UW system. And President Kevin Riley has left. He's gone off to Washington to work for an educational group there. And this past Monday, there was three public presentations by three finalists for system president. And a small committee of the regents was meeting yesterday to select a new president, and we should know by this Friday who the new W system president will be. And one of the finalists is the UW College's UW Extension Chancellor Ray Cross, so one of our own, so to speak. And Personally, I think Ray would be a great choice for UW system president, and I'm not just obliged to say that. In fact, I'm not obliged to say that, but I'm not just saying that. I think Ray has our head office is in Madison. He's a frequent visitor to the legislature in Madison. He's well respected by legislators. He'd be a great choice in terms of legislative relations. He at one time was the president of a community and technical college in Minnesota, so he understands the value of that education. He's also worked in the automotive industry in Michigan. He was the president also of a SUNY campus in New York, so he has fantastic academic and background, as well as he's a real innovator. The UW has recently implemented a flex option degree. I don't know if you're familiar with that new idea, but that new way of getting a degree was Ray's brainchild. So he knows that the higher education scene is shifting, is changing. People are reevaluating higher education in many ways, and he's been at the forefront of change in Wisconsin. I think he'd be a great choice for system president. But we'll see. The announcement will be made on Friday. As far as UWMC is concerned, next week we're hosting some middle school students here for Think College. I'll be teaching a couple of sessions in geology to them. It's great to get back in the classroom. I've got to keep those middle students under control, of course. And also on January 31st, I'll be hosting a Robert Burns Supper, which is a celebration of Scottish culture. And we do it every other year. And this year the theme is going to be Robert Burns songs, so there'll be some performances there. He wrote quite a few songs, as well as taking traditional songs and giving them the sort of final form. So if you're familiar, for example, with the song Auld Lang Syne, maybe you are, maybe you sing it at New Year's. That was actually a traditional song, but it was Burns that gave it its final form, and it's the form that we know it today, and we often think it was his particular poem. So we're singing some other songs as well that are representative of his work. So if you'd like to come to that international dinner, January 31st, that would be great. Classes begin on January 27th. Right now we've got a winterim session in effect. We didn't cancel that on Monday. So again, welcome to UWMC. I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday, but have a great day, and I know you have a great speaker here this morning because I've heard her before. So and welcome in.
We've got a few more people that need some seats in there, so while they're, if you'll let them climb over and get in while I introduce, and there's 2 seats right down front as well. And, so we do want everybody to get a seat. Oh, and we have a purse. Okay, right there. Thank you. Our speaker today is from Wausau, via Washington, D.C. these days. Ann Speckhard's father taught here at UWMC. Some of you might have known Phil Gillette. He was a mathematics. And Ann was the featured speaker as a Wausau West graduate for the Wausau School District Foundation this past November. Some of you might have caught that presentation. And we were very fortunate to be able to get her to come back to Wausau during the deep freeze, as it says freeze there on on the screen. We had to do a little bit of rerouting, and she was flexible enough to be able to make it and switch and come today rather than yesterday so that we could get her here. Ann has had a great experience in world affairs and in talking with terrorists, and I'm not going to take any of her thunder and spend any more time on introducing her because you want to hear Ann Speckhard. Here she is.
Thank you. It's nice to be here in Wausau. It did take a little bit of work and rerouting to get here, but here I am. So I'm going to start from the introduction of my book. This is Talking to Terrorists. And if you don't know, my husband Daniel is also from Wausau, and he is a U.S. ambassador. Excuse me, Mr. Ambassador, but do you know where your wife is? It was 7 a.m., and my husband of 24 years, Daniel Speckhard, a diplomat posted to NATO's international staff in Belgium, was standing at the door of our home in Brussels, barely awake. One of the plainclothes agents handed him an FBI calling card. Daniel rubbed his eyes and asked, "Excuse me? What?" "We're sorry, Ambassador Speckhard, to disturb you like this, but your wife has been running around in Gaza, meeting with terrorists. Is she pulling a Patty Hearst or something?" My husband, now wide awake, said, "No, wait a minute." He invited them to come in and take a seat while he ran up to my office and returned with papers in hand. My wife is a university professor, a psychologist. She's an expert on terrorism. She studies this type of thing, does interviews. Here's her latest paper and her Georgetown business card, he said, handing them a thick document. "She's a professor?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Well, sir, we received a very angry phone call from the Israelis last night accusing us of running an undisclosed agent, CIA agent, in Gaza. They thought your wife was undercover." At this, Daniel laughed. "She's got nothing to do with the CIA, at least not that I know of." "Okay, sorry for disturbing you, but could you please ask her to come in and talk to us when she gets back? It might be a good idea to discuss security issues with her, how to stay safe." Daniel nodded. Yes, he thought, that would be a good idea. In that episode, I was just out of Gaza, and as you heard, the Israelis, when they found out I was there, got very alarmed, and they had held me and my student Ken, who I was traveling with. Let's see. This is Ken in the center there, and that's the checkpoint that you go through from Israel to get into Gaza. And when we came back, they were asking us lots of questions, and I had been coached to not admit that I was talking to terrorists, because otherwise you can't get in and out of Palestine through Israel. And I didn't like handling things that way, but we kept it up until at some point when I'd been held for 5 or 6 hours, I said, "I'm supposed to meet my Israeli colleague tonight for dinner. Can you tell me?" They hadn't taken my phone away. "Can you tell me, am I going to be able to meet him?" And they said, "Who is your colleague? What's his name?" And I said, "His name's Reuven Paz. He used to work for the Shin Bet. He's one of yours." And they said, "Give us his phone number." And they called him up. So, and I also called Reuben at the same time and got him first and said, Reuben, they're going to be calling you, and I don't want you to lie to your own government, but I haven't told them what I'm doing. And he said, I'm not going to lie to my own government, but don't worry, you'll be coming out of the checkpoint. And he told them that I'm also a Holocaust researcher and what I was doing. And then at the checkpoint, we ended up having more of a conversation with this very scared and flustered Israeli soldier. Do you need me to use this? Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now? Oh, I'm so sorry. How about now? Is it better? Okay. Okay. Well, I'm sorry if you missed the beginning. Okay. And anyway, this very flustered soldier was asking us, You've been interviewing suicide terrorists, because we admitted to her at that point what we were doing. And we said, no, they're not about to attack. We've been interviewing the families of dead suicide terrorists. They've already attacked. And we went to visit their homes and ask, how did they get on the terrorist trajectory? What turned them into a terrorist? What kind of things happened to make, we hope, an ordinary person into a terrorist? And I'll show you in a while, but maybe you can see from here. This is the cover of my book, and I have a little girl on the cover, and I did that intentionally. This little girl, I met her in Nablus in a safe house, and we had gone to Nablus to interview the senders of 2 suicide bombers who had just attacked in Tel Aviv. And the senders agreed to meet us in the safe house, and it was very scary. And we were asking her mother why she was participating in terrorism, why she had given refuge to these people, how she could justify sending people. But the little girl, who was only 4 years old, got frightened and she went and got a gun. And let me go forward on the slides because I can show you her. Yeah, here she is. This is her. And she went and got a gun, and at first we didn't know if it was a toy or a real gun. But that was her instinct, that I have to protect my family. This is a violent environment. I need a gun. And she pointed it at me, and I ascertained whether it was a real or a toy, and it was a toy, thank God. And then the mother explained to me, she thinks you're Israelis and that you've come to possibly arrest us, and she wants to protect me. And then the interpreter immediately showed her, no, you're not holding the gun correctly. And so you get the stance, the correct stance. And she's only 4 years old. So one of the things is I went through places like the West Bank and Gaza and many other places, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, through Western Europe, Belgium, UK, France, Morocco, talking to would-be and family members of terrorists. I talked to over 400 people that were either terrorists, terrorist leaders, would-be suicide bombers, family members of actual bombers, supporters of bombers, all different facets of terrorism. Over and over again, it was brought home to me that terrorists are made, not born. They start out like innocent children, of course, just like the rest of us, but they're born into circumstances that really favor becoming violent. So shortly before this phone call that my husband got and being stopped at first the checkpoint for 6 hours, I did have my dinner with Reuben. And then we went to the airport and we weren't allowed to fly. We ended up flying a day late. And I had many adventures at the airport with the Israelis. They have a love-hate relationship with me because they do understand that I'm a supporter of Israel and love Israel. But they don't like people going into the West Bank and Gaza. And they said, look, you go into Lebanon and talk to Hezbollah. You go between Gaza and West Bank, talk to Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP. You're in Brussels talking to Hamas. How do we know that you won't feel sympathetic at some point and carry a message or carry money or inadvertently carry anything? So they go through all of my stuff. And I had a bit of an adventure that time at the airport. But I had just been in Jenin and talking to Zachariah Zubeidi. Let's see, I can't remember what pictures I have here. And of course, my research question was, what puts an individual on the terrorist trajectory, and what could possibly take him back off of it? And Zachariah Zubeidi, I think I've got, no, let's see. No, he's not on here. Sorry, I can't remember what's on these pictures. But this is Ahmed Sadat. He's another terrorist leader from the PFLP. And with all of them, I was asking, why are you sending terrorists, and why are you equipping suicide bombers, and what is the mentality of these people? And with Zubeidi, Zachariah here looks pretty nice. He's in prison. Ahmed Sadat looks pretty nice. He's sitting in prison in Jericho. He's got this nice easy chair inside the prison. But when I went to visit Zubeidi, it wasn't quite like that. He was a fugitive. Israel had him on a targeted list. And we had just finished an interview with a family of a suicide bomber. And afterwards I asked, can I meet Zubeidi? Because we were in Jenin. And they decided, I think they had watched me all day long, and decided, she's okay. Yes, we'll agree. And they brought me into a room, and he came in with all his cadres. He had the big automatic rifle, and all of his colleagues had them as well. And we sat down. And they positioned themselves throughout the room and by the windows, and they were constantly looking out the window for the Israelis, basically, because Zubeidi was on a targeted list and could receive the missile at any moment. And as we started the interview, I switched off my phone because I know enough about security that I know that it can be a listening device. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm turning off my phone because I don't want the Mossad to get the interview through my phone. If they want to interview you, they have to find you themselves." And he kind of looked at me like, "Oh, that's stupid." And he took his phone and threw it on the coffee table that was sitting between us. And I have many friends in Israel. I lecture often to their security apparatus. And I had heard other lecturers, generals in the IDF, tell that they were very proud of their targeted assassination program, that they could pretty much target within 14 centimeters and hit the person. And I remember looking and thinking, that coffee table, that's about, I'm sort of in range. And, but I pretty much had made my decision. I'm here, now I'm going to learn, I'm going to take advantage of that. I've put myself in this danger. And I started asking him questions, and his phone rang. And he picked up his phone and he said, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" And both of us were like, because that's how they figure out where you are. They get a voice recognition, and then they triangulate from your cell phone on where you are, and shortly after you get the missile. So he threw his phone down on the table, and then he looked at me. And up to that point, I'd been really faltering in the interview. I couldn't get an attachment with him, and I really felt strong disrespect. And suddenly, I saw him look at me like, "You didn't move your chair away. You didn't get scared." And I was terrified. But I just decided, if the missile's coming, it's coming. There's nothing I can do. And so we went on with our interview. And I asked him, how you have hundreds of kids coming to you asking to be equipped as bombers, and some of them you put a vest on and send them into Israel. How do you decide who, and what do they look like psychologically? And at this point, I had interviewed bombers that wanted to be. I had interviewed bombers that had either carried bombs or gotten arrested before they carried the bomb in the Israeli prison. And I had talked to nearly 100 parents of bombers or siblings of bombers, the dead ones. And but I wanted to know from the sender's point of view. And this Ahmed Sadat is also a sender, but from the PFLP. And I asked him the same question. But with Zubeidi, he looked at me like, "That's a crazy question." And he said, "They're holy, they're martyrs, they're willing to give their life for the struggle." And I said, "Yeah, but what are they like psychologically? What's their psychological state?" And he said, "Well, they're holy." And he said, "And that's a stupid question. I could ask you, what does a person look like that's up on top of a 20-story building that's about to jump? What's their psychological state?" Well, actually, I know the answer to that question. So I told him, that's a good question. And there's people in the States that have studied actual suicides, and they do what's called a psychological autopsy after the suicide. And that's what we did the same with all of these hundreds of suicide bombers that we interviewed their families. And in the case of normal suicide in the state, they'll look at their writings, whatever letter they left behind, and chillingly, people videotape and audiotape themselves a lot when they commit suicide. So these researchers actually watch these videotapes of somebody stepping off the ledge in a building and what their psychological state is beforehand. And what they found is that people are in a horrible amount of psychological agony before they commit suicide. It's been labeled psych ache. They're in horrible pain. And right before they kill themselves, they go dissociative. They stop feeling, and they just become very psychologically numb. And I explained this to Zubaydi, and he got totally intrigued. And from that moment on, I had him in my hand. And he said, oh my God, that happens to me. Because I asked him, do you understand this concept, dissociation? Yes, I understand it. That happens to me. That happened to me the last time the Israelis surrounded me. I was in this small shed, and I knew that they were going to kill me, that my time was up. So I decided that I was going to exit with my rifle, shoot as many of them as I could, but I was going to stand there and become a martyr. And I had the martyr's mentality. But then, at the last minute, when I opened the door, something switched in me, and I switched back to being a fighter. And I ran out of there, and I did shoot, but I ran and ran. And they shot me in the leg, but I got away. And he said, I know exactly what you're talking about. And he said, the people that come to me are all dissociative. And they want a bomber's vest. And we had, at this point, talked a bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said they all are highly traumatized by all the things that are going on in their lives. And their response has and they're in a lot of pain. And their response has been to become dissociative and to not feel anymore at all. And they come begging him for a vest, and when he says, no, I'm not going to send you, they say to him things like, well, then I'll go to my kitchen knife, and I'll carry a knife to the checkpoint, and I'll kill one Israeli, but I'm going to do this. And he said, for us, as fighters, we feel this from time to time. He said, now I feel it every night. I'm a fugitive under hunt. They're trying to kill me. And he said, right now I'm with you, but at night, I'm not there. And he said, how I get myself back is I go around town shooting my gun and making people wake up, or I shoot dogs. You know, Muslims don't particularly like dogs. And it was really interesting because his cadres were like, that's you that does that? And he's like, yeah, that's me. That's me trying to get myself back. And he said, but fighters keep themselves present through their anger and through continuing to fight. But the ones that are going to go be bombers pretty much have given up, and they're just numb. So I was already thinking that that was the case, but it was really interesting to hear someone that had hundreds of people that were coming to him, and he had equipped, I think it was 25 bombers at that point. And he went on to tell me, I said, well, you have young women and young men coming to you. What has made you decide not to equip the women? Because he didn't send any women. And it was just starting in Israel at that point. We had Wafa Idris, and we had about 14 women that had gone as suicide bombers. And he said, there's plenty of men, so I don't send the women. And I said, is there a difference between the two? And he said, yes, there's many, many more women that come begging for a bomb, which really surprised me. And I said, why is that? And again, he said, he wasn't very psychological. He said, I don't know. And I said, well, think about it. Why? And he said, well, I guess they can't be fighters. They can't come and ask me for a gun because I'm not going to give it to them. So they're never going to be a fighter. This is their only way to fight back. And so that was interesting also. I went from there to, I can't remember the sequence right this second, but I also went in the Israeli prison. One of my colleagues took me in with him and had the privilege of talking to people that had been equipped as bombers. So we went into the prison near Tel Aviv and met Erin Ahmed. And Erin had actually worn a bomb. She'd worn the bomb. She'd been in a event where there were 2 bombers that were sent near Tel Aviv to bomb. One was a young boy and one was her. She was a college student. And the boy detonated himself, and her job was to detonate he detonated himself. She was to detonate within 10 or 15 minutes after a crowd drew around the victims so that there would be even more killing. And we asked her, how did you get into this? I mean, how did you make this career choice? And anyway, she told us, I was a normal college student. I was in love with this guy, and I was pretty much a feminist, and I was going to go into banking. I was going to get my master's, and I dressed normally. I smoked cigarettes. I went out dancing, and she was pretty liberal for her society, and I intended to get married and move out of the West Bank. She lived near Bethlehem, and I think she was going to go to Dubai and be a banker. And she had big dreams for herself. And she said she was particularly in love with this young man because he agreed with her vision for herself. He didn't necessarily want her to be a traditional woman, although she planned to get married and have a family and all of that. Well, her boyfriend was more militant than her, and there's 2 stories to what happened to him. He either exploded himself trying to make a bomb, or the Israelis gave him a missile. And the Palestinian story is that the Israelis targeted him, but anyway, he ended up dead, fried in a car from an explosion that the Palestinians believe was from a missile. And she, within 2 weeks, suddenly became extremely conservative, put on the hijab, put on the long robe, and she went to Hamas and she said, give me a bomb, I want to revenge for him. And I've read different things now since I've interviewed her, and in some things she said, I wasn't even particularly that serious, I just was running my mouth. But they saw their opportunity. And as I told you, they were just starting to use women in Palestine. And usually you see groups in Islamic areas that are conservative start to use women when men can't get across the checkpoints anymore. So Israelis they search women pretty carefully, but they're respectful of the modesty that Islamic women usually want, and they don't search them as closely, and they wear big robes, so it's easier for them to smuggle things. And within this 2-week period, within a week or 2 after she went and said this, they equipped her with a bomb. So she didn't have her mind totally made up. And you see this group that's willing to use her when she's in a period of traumatic grief, and basically to manipulate her. So she knows they're there ready for her, and she carried the bomb, and she intended to detonate it. But she said, as she was walking around milling about the crowds, and the boy had already detonated himself, she saw a little baby. And she said she suddenly was struck with, Allah gives life, and only Allah takes life. And I'm not allowed to take life. So she had her she went to a phone booth, and she called her senders, and she said, come back and get me. Well, she ended up getting arrested as a result. But now that she was in prison, she said, I really do feel that they manipulated me and used me in a time of grief. And now when I'm back into my normal mind, I would never do anything like this. And that's a quite common story, actually. So in that same period in prison, we interviewed another woman, and Erin agreed to translate for us. Her name was Amaya Damaj. And Amaya was very interesting. She was from Jenin. She wasn't living in Jenin at the time that the Israeli soldiers surrounded it. They were getting really sick of Zubeidi and his sending bombers into Israel. There was a bomber every week in Israel. So the IDF and the political leadership decided that each one of these towns that was a hotbed of terrorism, they would surround them, and they would figure out who the militants were and arrest them or kill them. And they wanted to put an end to suicide bombing inside Israel. And they hadn't built the wall completely yet at that point. And Amaya was watching this on television, and always there's some collateral damage. So in this case, there was a little girl that was killed, and they were showing her on TV a lot. And Amaya spoke to me like she had seen this girl killed herself. And a couple times I had to ask her, Amaya, did you see this, or did you see it on television? And then she would correct and say, well, it was on television, but I feel like I saw it myself. And I wanted to revenge for her. So she too went to a group and asked to be equipped with a bomb. But because there were all these Israeli incursions, they couldn't get her across a checkpoint and they couldn't get the bomb to her. So she waited about 6 weeks for her bomb. And I remember my Israeli colleague was like, that's not possible. Nobody could keep their psychological readiness to kill themselves all that time. And I said, no, I don't think so. I think it is possible. And it turned out she described to us the same thing that Zubeidi described, that she was really dissociative. But not only was she dissociative, she was euphoric. So she had moved into a part of her mind where she didn't feel the terror of going to kill herself. She didn't feel the horror of going to kill other people. In fact, she rejoiced in it because she considered it revenge and a point for her side. And probably because we all have psychological mechanisms to get us through deep pain, like a football player that's injured, our Green Bay guys, they go in and they get their steroid shots and whatever shots they need to keep going, but their body has a internal pharmacy as well. We know this from soldiers and football players and other athletes, that when they're injured, oftentimes their body naturally releases endorphins to keep them going. And then only after they realize, oh my God, I've actually fractured my ankle or, really injured myself, and now I feel the pain. Well, what I found was with these people that were going forward to suicide, they were getting, I think, a similar release of endorphins because they were having this high. And Amaya described it in detail. Even when I was interviewing her, she became giddy and drunk. And I turned to the translator, who was Erin, and I said, will you ask her, was she using drugs during this time period? Was she drinking? Was she having sex? And Erin said that I will never ask a Palestinian woman this question. That's such an insulting question. And I said, Erin, please, because I want to understand, and explain to her I don't mean an insult. And she answered, no, are you joking? And, that doesn't happen in our culture. Of course it does, but she said it didn't. And anyway, I said, well, can you feel how you're giddy right now? And she said, yes, this is exactly how I felt back then. So even in the interview, she pulled it up. And she was like she was drunk and laughing and, euphoric, basically. So think about if a group is trying to manipulate someone and they can talk them into carrying a suicide bomb, and beforehand they convince them that this is for a religious reason, you're doing this for God, for Allah, for whatever, and they feel this euphoria, they can translate that in their own minds into religious ecstasy. And it's very, very powerful. And not only that, it's what I call psychological first aid of a very short-lived nature for PTSD. So they're in horrible, horrible pain. They're in this deepest psychache, which we know is a strong vulnerability for committing suicide. And someone gives them something that makes them not feel the psychache, but feel euphoria. That's really scary. And then not only that, I had this student that I showed you earlier, Ken. We can go back to Ken for a second. These are some other terrorists here. This guy, Ken, he had... he's the one that talked me into going into the West Bank and Gaza because Ken had gone for a semester abroad, and he had gone to Israel. He was at Hebrew U, and in his first day visiting his new school, he went to the Hebrew U cafeteria. He had lunch, met an Israeli soldier, and they got into a bit of a debate about how the Israelis treat the Palestinians. Ken's from Ireland, and he said, I don't agree with how you do things. And the Israeli soldier said, you haven't seen people die yet. You haven't had your friends die from a suicide attack. You don't know what we face. If you lived here longer and saw what I saw, you'd probably agree with me. And they agreed to disagree. Ken walked out of the cafeteria, and it blew up. And Ken was so traumatized. So Ken was in my psychology class, and he would ask over and over again, why aren't you studying the Palestinians? He knew I was studying the Chechens, who are a whole other case, but similar. And I had, there's 15 Chechen suicide bombers at this point, maybe a few more, because they've been active lately with the Olympics. And we had done psychological autopsies on half of them. And he kept saying, why aren't you studying the Palestinians? He wanted to go in and study the Palestinians, and he eventually talked me into it. But we did what we called a thought experiment in Brussels. I was teaching in Brussels at the time. And we asked normal students to come in and pretend that they were a suicide bomber, pretend that they'd been arrested, and that we were interviewing them in prison. And the kids thought this was kind of weird, but they agreed and they got into a role play. Well, they were only in the role play for between 15 minutes to half hour, maybe 45 minutes. And towards the end of the role play, we would ask, okay, well, you got this suicide vest and you put it on. What did it feel like? And these are kids just pretending. They don't know anything about it. They were all different nationalities. And they would say, I felt so powerful. I was outside of my body looking down at myself. I felt euphoria. And I thought, oh my God, we can induce this just even in an experiment. And that's frightening to me. I just checked my clock and see I'm going to run out of time. But you can read the book. But anyway, I want to leave some time for questions for you. I did end up, the Department of Defense asked me if I would go into Iraq, and we had 20,000 detainees at the time, and if I would help them make what at that time we were calling a deradicalization program. And this is Camp Bucca. I worked in Camp Bucca and Camp Cropper, and we tried to identify who were the people that were following the ideology. And we tried to figure out, could we de-radicalize them? So we got imams, and we got psychologists, and we met with these people on a daily basis, or our plan was, to try to address the traumas that they had undergone, and to try to convince them that the ideology that they were following was not actually Islamic. And I'm sorry to say it wasn't carried out as I planned it, but I thought our plan was pretty good. And I do believe that we can try to talk terrorists out of terrorism, because if we address some of these very things, the things that they're giving psychological first aid for, if we address them in other ways, we can get them off the terrorist trajectory. But just to sum up what I learned, I went through conflict zones, and I learned that there's a recipe for terrorism. It's got 4 ingredients to make a lethal blast. There's a group, and let's see. There's leaders like this guy. These are the Chechens. This is Basayev and Hatab. They've both been assassinated by the Russians at this point. Hatab got a poisoned letter, and Basayev, I think, got bullets or a bomb. I'm not sure. They sent him poisoned socks, but he was too smart. He hung them up, and some chickens were killed, and then he figured out not to wear those socks. But interestingly, he said since the Russians were willing to use poison against him, he was willing to engage with weapons of mass destruction. And his group is still active, and his group is the group that we will see if the Olympics are attacked, or if transport to the Olympics are attacked. But anyway, in this lethal cocktail, the 4 ingredients are a group that has a political motivation. So in this case, the Chechens want independence. They want to claim the Caucasus as a Muslim territory. They believe that Sochi was Muslim originally, and they want it back, and they don't want the Olympics there. Ahmed Sadat is part of a group. He wants Palestine free. He doesn't want it under occupation anymore. He wants his own state, his own land. He's not sure how he feels about Israel existing. He wants it to be one land, and eventually the Palestinians take over, I would say. But these groups all have a political goal. Then they have an ideology. They have something that they use to convince their adherents that attacking civilians is okay. So they either argue it's a cosmic battle, it's for God, the things that are happening are so wrong that we're justified, or Ahmed Sadat would say things like, well, there's no civilian in Israel. And I would say, are you saying women and children aren't civilians? And he'd say, well, the children grow up to be in the army. Everyone's in the army. The women are in the army. They're in the reserves. Every single adult is is in the military, which is not actually true, but that was his argument. So there's a group, there's an ideology that justifies terrorism. Then there's some level of social support. In the West Bank and Gaza, it's close to 90%. In Boston, where Tamerlan Tsarnaev lived, it's probably close to 0%. But somewhere, whoever's going to engage in terrorism, if they get social support, they begin to believe, yes, this is justified, this is a good thing, I should do it. So there's a group, an ideology, social support, and then there's the individual. What are his vulnerabilities? And I found when I went through conflict zones, the vulnerabilities were all about revenge and trauma. But I also went to Morocco. I went through Brussels, talking to the second and third generation Islamic immigrants there, mostly Moroccan. In Paris, talking to Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians. In the UK, talking to Pakistanis and Kashmiris. And they have different individual vulnerabilities. If you come to Belgium, your parents came to Belgium and worked in the coal mine, and then you're the second generation and you go to college and you want to have a bright future, but you're told when you go to a job interview, I'm sorry, Ahmed, I'd never hire anybody with your name, or I'm sorry, Fatima, we would never hire anybody that wears a headscarf. After a while, you start to feel marginalized, discriminated, and angry. And then if a group with its ideology and its political goals gets a hold of you, it can start manipulating you. So there's these four things that come together. And they act differently in conflict zones than non-conflict zones. And I think, let's just look at the rest of the slides. Oh, I also want to make the point that terrorism is not just an Islamic phenomena. This is from the Army of God. I served on a case with Jennifer Spurl. She was manipulated at a particular point of vulnerability to follow Christian scriptures that were used to justify terrorism in behalf of this group that had a political goal to end abortion. So it's not just Islam. Any religion that has any scriptures that in certain cases justifies violence can be used to manipulate for terrorism. This is the home of Wafa Idris. You see how little kids can be brought into it so early. This is her niece and nephew standing in front of this poster that every single day they see glorifying the first female suicide bomber, their aunt. And these are little kids in Ramallah looking at similar type posters. So you can see the level of social support that's in the West Bank. They're just inundated with songs about martyrs, posters, movies. Anytime anyone goes to martyr themselves, they're immediately made into a hero. These little kids just about broke my heart in Ramallah. I was walking along the street, and they suddenly came out of the darkness with their little AK-47s, they're just wood, that they put black masking tape around or electrical tape to make them look like real guns. And they started asking for documents. And even though they were speaking in Arabic, you got it. It was a checkpoint. And we know that kids all over the world, if they see things that are frightening to them, they replay it. It's called traumatic play. And here these kids were replaying the same thing. And I asked them to pose. That's their happy faces, but they weren't looking happy when they were asking for our documents. And I always use this slide as a picture of social support. If your granny is carrying a grenade launcher, you know, she's probably telling you in our society engaging in this type of behavior is socially supported, because whatever grandma says is okay, probably you'll agree is okay, right? And I told you about that. And, you know, here you see a little kid. It's always the collateral damage that gets people just crazy and willing to take part in terrorism in conflict zones. And I didn't get a chance to tell you, but it's in the book. There's a whole soccer team that joined one by one. And it's similar to here. This is Fadi, who was in the Hebron soccer team. They all went and suicided. And we know this in high schools, that if you get one suicide here, right away you have to rush in with the social workers and the psychologists, because kids have a contagion effect. Adults too. We know that if you have a suicide in a family, you have a 25% increased risk of someone in that family suiciding. I don't know what it is in a school, but it does happen this way. This is Aaron Ahmed, who I told you about earlier. That was what she did. This is Zachariah Zubeidi. That's probably the gun he had on his lap while he was talking to me. This is in the UK, and I didn't get to tell you a chance about that. And this is my contact details. If you want to know anything more, feel free to contact me. And we've got a few minutes for questions, and I thank you for your attention.
Let's give Ann a round of applause. Do we have some questions? We'll use the mic for those that do. Okay, we'll start right here.
The second lady that didn't blow herself up, what was her story?
Amaya?
No, the one she
The one that was euphoric?
interpreted for, yes.
Her story was that she waited for her mom for this 6-week period, and she wanted to revenge for what had happened in Jenin. But when she went to the checkpoint, she was going to go into Israel proper and strap on her bomb. She didn't have the bomb with her. She was going to meet the sender in Israel. And the Israelis figured it out. They have a lot of collaborators, and they arrested her. But I think that if she got released, she would still do it. That's how she sounded to me. She wasn't repentant. Here's a question in the back here. Okay.
No, let's use the microphone because not everybody can hear you.
I think it's very interesting that you're approaching this on an individual level, but don't you think it would be far more effective to correct the circumstances in Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza Strip? I mean, those people are living under horrendous conditions. Certainly, 97% approval would go down if they were to be able to get jobs and trade and water and whatever.
It's a very good point. And as a psychologist, I had the opportunity to talk to people on the individual level, but I was always looking at exactly these things, that the politics of it, and that's the group level, the 4 levels. And in the case of the Palestinians, there's fault on both sides. Like the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, but in Gaza they kept shooting their missiles over. And it goes back and forth. But absolutely, if they improved their conditions, if the kids felt hope, if they saw something that gave them a probability for another career choice, some of them wouldn't choose terrorism. And the other thing is there's no psychological help for them. In the West Bank, there at the time I was interviewing, there was one psychologist and she had shut down. In Gaza, there was one clinic, and the guy that ran it has just passed. So I'm not sure if the clinic is still running. And think about it, if an entire population is routinely traumatized, some of it by their own fault, but if they're routinely traumatized and there's no help for them and no hope for them, as you said, economically and otherwise, we're just going to see more and more of this. But the same thing is true about our drone warfare. When we have collateral damage, when we're droning terrorist leaders and they live with their families and we take out the whole family, it just comes back to us. So there's a whole political, social level that, of course, has to be addressed. Thank you.
We have a question here.
I'm wondering if you can take any of your studies and translate back to what's been happening in the United States with these mass shootings that are going on. How can you use what you know about other countries and help us understand that problem?
I think that the question's very good about the school shootings and the mass shootings, and I think they're completely different phenomena. They're not political, for one thing. They're usually people that are mentally ill. And one argument that's been made that terrorists are chillingly normal and psychologically healthy, I would agree that that's true, except in conflict zones they have PTSD, although everybody has PTSD, or a large portion of the population. And the PTSD, as I was telling you, plays into how they get manipulated and how willing they are to die because they're in terrible pain. But they're not psychotic or schizophrenic. In fact, the terrorist groups would never choose somebody like that because they're not reliable. They talk, they don't keep secrets, and you don't know what they're going to do. They're crazy. And but one parallel that does go with the shootings in the schools is the wide availability of assault rifles. And we've seen it now. We've seen it in India, and we've seen it in Kenya, that terrorists easily got a hold of weapons. Oh, we saw it in Beslan with a school takeover. They got a hold of weapons, and we saw a mass hostage taking, and we saw 2 slaughters. And I think, okay, we have all this airport security, but we have huge congregations of people waiting to go through those lines, right, in big airports. When are we going to see somebody come in with an assault rifle from a terrorist group? And, I hope, knock on wood, we never see it. But it's something to think about, because and Al-Qaeda is telling people, get a gun inside the States and attack. So thank you for your question.
I have a 2-part question. How did you initially get into this field of study, and how in the world do you get into interviewing these the leaders of the terrorist groups, who really most of the time do not respect women at all? How do you get in there to get to talk to them?
It's a good question. I fell into this. We were working in Belgium because Dan was posted to NATO, and the science committee at NATO asked me if I would start looking at religion and terrorism. So I was looking at it academically. Then 9/11 happened, and the embassy asked me if I would run stress debriefings for our diplomats, because after 9/11 they were talking about, in October, NATO had specified that they were going to attack. I think they picked October 10th as the date that they were going to attack NATO. And as a response to that, we had machine guns and barbed wire and tanks and things outside of NATO. And the diplomats were frightened, of course. And then Nord Ost happened in Moscow, and I have a very good friend that's the top psychologist in Moscow. And I asked her, what are you doing for your hostages? There were 800 hostages, and 300 of them were killed by the Russian gas. They were sitting in a theater like this, taken by the Chechens. And I said, what are you going to do for those? We did these stress debriefings. And she said, welcome, come if you want. And so I just step by step fell into it. And then this Ken dragged me farther, got me to go into West Bank and Gaza. And I found out that I have a personality that people trust. And I think it's because I'm sincere. I wasn't working for the CIA or the police, and I sincerely said that. And I was a university professor. I didn't advertise that I was American. I didn't lie and say I wasn't, but I was coming from Belgium, and I had an appointment at a university there. So I said, I'm from Belgium, and I'm from this university, or I'm coming from Belgium. And I think being a woman helped me. There were drawbacks, but women can talk to other women. And I always had a guide with me that was a young man, sometimes my students. And that resonated with their culture, because Ken, I helped treat him for his PTSD, and my other student who likes to go by the name Al, that's not his real name, we really loved each other. I mean, I loved them like maternally, and as professors loved their students, and they adored me. And everybody felt that. So that went with their cultural stereotypes of they really respect their mothers. So they were like, oh, this is a good mother. And also men don't get to talk to women. If it's a conservative culture, they don't talk in depth to women outside of their families. There's no psychologists. So once I won the trust, and I won it in a snowball kind of way, I would get an interview just about what it's like to live in Belgium as a Moroccan, or what it's like to be in Palestine, and then that would lead to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, and I'd get closer and closer to extreme danger. And these people would really get fascinated with themselves. They would, like Zabedi saying, oh, that happened to me, I know what that is, and that happens to me with the stealth. And then we got all into his PTSD, and when we stood up, the cadres came to me and said, we have never seen an interview of Zachariah like that before, thank you. And I found that people really thanked me for interviewing them, which was kind of gratifying. It was cool.
We have time for one more question.
Behind you.
Okay, right back here from one of our students.
I know you talked a lot about religious ideologies. Do you think that profile of the religious extremist is different than the political extremist,
I think,
like the IRA in the 80s and 90s?
I think that there's a difference, but they're both true believers. So they begin to believe in the ideology of their cause, and that their cause is right, and that it justifies extreme means. And if it has the God part in it, it makes it easier to suicide or to risk your own life, because if you believe in a religion that has an afterlife, and if you're in a lot of pain, there can be a real positive to imagining or believing, and if it's true, that when you push this button, you're on the other side, and things are good over there. And in the case of Islamic martyrdom, they believe that they go immediately. They believe that 70 of their relatives will also go immediately upon their death as a reward for what they did. So that's pretty strong.
Thank you, Anne,
You're
very
welcome.
much. Let's give her a round of applause.